Today I wanted to talk about one of my favorite techniques that easily makes any drawing look 10 times more polished. Now this technique revolves around using toned paper, or at least something that can act as a mid-tone for drawing on. In the past, I've done a wash of watercolor over a sketch to basically create my own toned paper. This is also really great because it means you can create a base surface in any color you want. But today I'll be using this gray toned paper. Now, of course, you're going to need to have some sort of a sketch or drawing to use for this technique, so I decided to sketch out Conchu from Moon Knight. Just kind of felt like drawing the crazy bird dude. But really, you can use this technique regardless of subject matter. I've used it all of the time for portraits, which of course you probably know is what I'm typically drawing, but even more illustrative, surrealistic things like I would consider this drawing gonna work great as well. So no matter what kind of art you enjoy making, you can probably find a use for this technique somewhere. Other than the toned paper, the main materials that this technique revolves around are a black and a white colored pencil. What you're going to do with these pencils is essentially shade or color in the shadows and highlights of your piece. I tend to start with the absolute darkest and most bright parts of whatever I'm drawing first, to first put those in so that I know that those sections are going to be the darkest or the lightest in the entire image. Now, I know this entire technique might seem ridiculously simple to a lot of people, but I really do not see that many people drawing this way other than people that very frequently use toned paper, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is kind of like a moot issue here, because as long as what you are drawing on is a mid-tone, you do not need to stick to toned paper. I use this all of the time in like watercolor paintings and stuff to give that section more dimension, or even as like a first pass in an illustration, so that again I know where the absolute darkest parts and the brightest parts are, and then from there I can start adding in more colors if I don't want to keep it so monochromatic. Although, speaking of monochromatic, I have again done this quite frequently with other colors. The white tends to stick for the highlight unless you don't want something so stark, but you can absolutely swap out the black for another deep color. Maybe you want to do like a deep purple or blue if you're working on a piece that maybe fits that color a little better, or you just do not want a super black and white image. Using color is super fun and again easy to use this technique on, but I cannot tell you how much I prefer not only doing this technique but also how it looks as opposed to the more traditional, shade in on white paper look. This just seemed so much more polished, even though I would consider it easier because you yourself can put in those absolute highlights and shadows in yourself with the two pencils and then work the two together and blend the tones more in the middle. Of course, there could be a decent amount of the actual paper showing through in whatever you're working on, which you do want to use the color of the surface that you're working on to your advantage, but not every section that is brighter than your mid-tone is going to be stark white, and the deeper sections are not all going to be pitch black. So using those colored pencils lighter in certain areas to shade it in and create those values in between the brightest and darkest. I think that covers the explanation of the technique. So let's actually talk about this art that I'm working on here. I was a bit worried that this might have been a strange choice to use as like a demonstration piece for this technique. It's a video that I've wanted to do for a very long time, but I just kind of felt like drawing Conchu. Like I mentioned, he's a super cool character design, and it happened to work out because I felt like the finished product that I had in mind of what I wanted this to look like would work really well using this technique. The one thing that I did not like this technique for, though, was this background. I wanted it to be a night sky, and I started trying to shade it in for the purpose of this video, and I said forget it, and I switched to this like gray wash ink pen thing that I had laying around to color in the background instead. This obviously saved my hand, but I also like the look of it much better because using the different medium gave way more separation between Khonshu and the background, which I was worried about since he was going to be shadowed, and just the overall darkness of the image. I wanted him to stand out as much as he possibly could, even given the dimly lit conditions that I knew were going to start happening. So I'm very glad that that ended up working out well, because I did sort of just wing it out of nowhere spontaneously without giving it much thought. And I did end up doing a couple of layers of that just to darken up the sky to the value that I wanted it at, and also to try and blend out some of the pretty harsh brush strokes that the pen was just creating because the ink was drying so fast. The last step that I did to this piece was to finally add some white gel pen to the absolute highest points on Khonshu, but also to add some stars to the background, which eventually I figured this was, again, too much dotting and handwork, and so I flipped to my typical acrylic ink and a toothbrush method that I use for all of my galaxies, although apparently I forgot to film it, so sorry about that. But here's how the finished art turned out. But that is everything. I would love to know if you've ever used this technique in your artwork before, or if not, if you're going to try it out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.